Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. My name is Glenn Rawson, and thank you for being with me. I'm coming to you tonight from Keokuk, Iowa. We came out here on a Fun for Less church history trip. We started in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We went up through Philadelphia into New York, and from New York down to Ohio. And then from Ohio, from Cleveland, we flew to Kansas City. And for the last couple of days, we've been touring church history sites in Missouri, all the way from Independence up to Far West. And I thought tonight for the fireside, I would like to share with you some of the stories, history, and events from this part of church history, or places we've been over the last couple of days. I can't tell everything because I spent 3 days telling it, and I've only got an hour to tell you about it. But I'm going to bring you 5 stories from these places of church history. And the idea in mind is, if you've never come out here, if you've never seen these significant places where the revelations were received, all of our history is connected to a place, to a spot in geography, to dirt somewhere. And when you see that dirt, it makes those stories, revelations come to life. So for that, just for tonight, I'm going to take you on something of a church history trip with me. The first place I would like to take you is to the Far West Temple site in Far West, Missouri. In 1836, when the Latter-day Saints first came there, Caldwell County was virgin land. And it was there for the taking. And the Latter-day Saints homesteaded a lot of that ground. And immediately from 1836 to 1838, built a booming city of several thousand people in that area. And then it all began to unravel. Tensions escalated between the Latter-day Saints and the Missourians in late October, in October of 1838. And finally, by October 30th, it had reached a tipping point. There was the massacre at Haun's Mill, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, that had occurred on October 30th, 1838. And then October 31st, 1838, the prophet Joseph Smith is betrayed and arrested by Missouri state authorities and accused of treason. On the night of October 31st, the General Samuel D. Lucas sent an order to Colonel Alexander W. Donovan, and it said, "You will take the Mormon prisoners to the town square of Far West tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock and shoot them." Well, Joseph Smith was court-martialed. He wasn't a military man. The trial was illegal. And because of that, Donovan wrote back to his commanding officer and said, "It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. I will march my brigade for liberty tomorrow, and if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God." Donovan saved Joseph Smith's life. Joseph would later be taken, like November 2nd. He would then be taken south and eventually would be locked up in Liberty Jail. But when Joseph and the brethren were taken away from Far West, and as many as 60 some others were also arrested, the men that remained behind were ordered to come to the temple lot there, and to stack arms, and then to sit in a hollow square. Now, by this time, 3 days before, the governor had issued his extermination order, demanding that all Mormons be driven from the state or exterminated for the public good. The militia had sacked the city of Far West, and now all of the men that had not been arrested were ordered to the temple lot, grounded arms, and sitting in a hollow square, and there they sat for many hours under guard. They would stay that way, Heber C. Kimball said, all night long. And then, as Heber Kimball describes it, quote, "The mob commenced plundering the citizens of their bedding, money, wearing apparel, and everything of value they could lay their hands upon. Much property was destroyed, he said. The burning of houses, logs, rails, corn cribs, boards, etc., the using of corn and hay, the killing of cattle, sheep, hogs, etc., and all this, he said, without regard to owners or asking leave of anyone. In the meantime, men were abused, women insulted and treated with violence by the troops, while the men were kept prisoners. We were compelled at the point of bayonet to sign a deed of trust for the purpose of making our individual property liable, as they said, to pay all the debts of purses belonging to the church, and also for all damages the old inhabitants of Davis County might have sustained in consequence of the late difficulties in that county. End of quote. Well, while the prisoners were sitting there being abused and maligned by the militia, Heber described that some of their former brethren, members of the church, who had turned traitor and led the mobs through the city, they came forward. One of them was William E. McClellan, a former associate of Heber's in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. McClellan asked where Heber was. He was pointed out, and McClellan walked over to talk to Heber. Heber Kimball described that conversation. He said, "When he came up to me, he said, 'Brother Heber, what do you think of Joseph Smith, the fallen prophet, now? Has he not led you blindfolded long enough? Look and see for yourself, poor, your family stripped and robbed, and your brethren in the same fix. Are you not satisfied with Joseph?' And Heber said, I replied, 'Yes, I am more satisfied 100-fold than I was before. For I see you, McClellan, in the very position that he, Joseph, foretold you would be in, a Judas, to betray your brethren if you did not forsake your adultery, fornication, lying, and abominations. Where are you, McClellan? What are you about? You and Hinkle and scores of others. Have you not betrayed Joseph and his brethren into the hands of the mob as Judas did Jesus? Yes, verily you have. I tell you, Mormonism is true, and Joseph is a true prophet of the living God, and you, with all others that turn therefrom, will be damned and go to hell, and Judas will rule over you." End of quote. Brothers and sisters, what happened in Missouri was grievously wrong all those years ago. But out of it came sterling examples of beautiful faith and courage. And this is one of them. I declare to you, bless that soul who has the courage today to stand up before the world and declare that Joseph Smith is a prophet, then and now. Next story. One of the places we went this morning was the site of the Hans Mill Massacre, or more appropriately, the Hans Mill Martyrdom. I told them this story. In October of 1838, Amanda Barnes Smith and her family were part of the Kirtland Poor Camp on their way to Far West. They had stopped and were camped at Hans Mill, about 12 to 15 miles east of Far West. They were only going to be there a short time as they recruited their teams to move on in search of a new home free from the persecutions of Ohio. Suddenly, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon of October 30th, 1838, a mob of some 250 men swept down on the unsuspecting villagers. When that massacre was over, 17 men and boys lay dead, including Amanda's husband, Warren, and her son, Sardius. Another one of her sons was also wounded in the blacksmith shop that day. Her son, Alma, was also shot, blowing away his hip joint and leaving him horribly wounded. Amid the terrible cries of the grieving, the wounded, and the dying, Amanda endured a long night of terror as she ministered desperately to the needs of her wounded son, expecting, as she and her son Willard described it, that any minute the mob would return to finish their ghastly work of extermination. The next morning, in hurried desperation, those who survived gathered their beloved dead and dropped them into a dry well to keep them from the bounty and mutilations of the mob. While most of those left alive after Hans Mill left the state immediately, Amanda couldn't. Alma's wound made that impossible for her to move him. She was a prisoner, and indeed, the mob came back to Hans Mill and occupied the settlement, waving, as it were, the governor's extermination order, declaring that they had to leave the state immediately or they would be shot. Amanda couldn't leave. She couldn't stay, but she couldn't go. In the days and the weeks that followed, the mob continued to harass others and the women left behind, leaving them, as it were, in a state of constant fear. Prayer, Amanda said, was our only source of comfort. Our Heavenly Father, our only helper. None but He could save and deliver us. However, even that was to be denied them as the mob came and announced that if they did not stop their praying, every last one of them would be killed. Our prayers were hushed in terror, Amanda said. We dared not let our voices be heard. But to Amanda, this became unbearable. This godless silence, she said, was more intolerable than had been the night of the massacre. End quote. Finally, Amanda, when she could bear it no longer, she stole down to a cornfield, and there are still cornfields all around that area. She stole down to a cornfield and raised her voice to heaven. And we can only imagine the power and the sincerity and the heart of that prayer. It is recorded that as Amanda finished that prayer and started to leave the cornfield, a voice, not an impression, a voice as audible and plain as mine before you, spoke and said the following. It repeated a seldom sung verse from a familiar hymn. The voice said to Amanda, "That soul who on Jesus hath leaned for repose, I will not desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no, never, no, never forsake." End of quote. It was enough. It was comfort. From that moment on, Amanda said, I had no more fear. I felt that nothing could hurt me, she said. Soon after that, the mob came with another ultimatum that if she were not out of the state by a certain date, she would be killed. On that appointed day, the mob returned and demanded of her to know why she had not left the state. Boldly, Amanda faced the mob and demanded that they come into her home and see what they had done to her son that prevented her from leaving. The mobbers came in, gathered around Alma's bedside, and witnessed the grisly wound that he had suffered. They left without doing her any harm. Now, later, Alma was miraculously healed. And when Amanda wanted to leave the state, and now she could, she couldn't. Her horses had been taken by the mob. So, what did Amanda do? With courage, she went to the captain of the mob and demanded her horses back. I did not fear the captain, she said. And now listen, for I had the Lord's promise that nothing should hurt me. The captain told her she could have her horses if she'd pay $5 for their keep. Amanda said she didn't have any money. She refused to pay him. She walked out in the yard, threw a rope over her horse, and took him away. No one stopped her. Similarly, she recovered her other horse and was soon on her way out of the state and once again among her own people in Nauvoo. Amanda concludes her account with this testimony. The Lord had kept his word. That soul who on Jesus hath leaned for succor had not been forsaken, she said, even in this terrible hour of massacre. End quote. We were there today, standing on that hallowed ground of Hans Mill. It is to me not a sight so much of massacre, but of martyrdom. Those people were killed for no other reason than that they were Latter-day Saints and they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was not in any respect their fault. Come with me, and I'll take you to Hans Mill and let you feel the spirit of that sacred place. Again, yesterday, we stood at Adam's altar and again at the overlook of Adam-ondi-Ahman. One of the first settlers to come up into Adam-ondi-Ahman in early 1838 was Lyman White. Lyman White was a fierce Latter-day Saint. He had joined the church clear back on the Isaac Morley farm in 1830-31 in Kirtland. But now, as a faithful Latter-day Saint, he was commissioned a colonel in the militia of Caldwell County. When the Mormon-Missouri War was going on in October of 1838, Lyman White fought and defended his brethren from Adam-ondi-Ahman. And then, upon learning, this is like October 30th, 1838, upon learning that Far West was surrounded by an angry mob, Lyman White raised 53 volunteers in Adam-ondi-Ahman, 25 miles north, and went immediately to Far West to aid in its defense, where Joseph and Hiram and others were betrayed into the hands of their enemies by a Latter-day Saint by the name of Colonel George M. Hinkle. That happened on the 31st. And as I mentioned, Joseph and the others were sentenced by court-martial to be shot the next morning, November 1st. During the evening, between Joseph's sentencing to be shot for treason and the carrying out of the sentence the following morning, on the morning on November 1st, one of the militia generals, Moses Wilson, took Lyman White out by himself. White, by this time, had also been arrested and was a prisoner, and tried to induce Lyman White to betray Joseph Smith and swear falsely against him. In other words, turn state's evidence against Joseph, or in other words, become a traitor and betray Joseph. Lyman White would later record that their conversation went something like this. General Wilson: Colonel White, we have nothing against you, only that you are associated with Joseph Smith. He is our enemy and a damned rascal, and would take any plan he could to kill us. You're a damn fine fellow. If you'll come out and swear against him, we will spare your life and give you any office if you want. And if you don't do it, you will be shot tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Think of that offer. And they're not kidding. They're deadly serious. How would you answer? Colonel White responded thus: General Wilson, you are entirely mistaken in your man, both in regard to myself and Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith is not an enemy to mankind. He's not your enemy, but is as good a friend as you've got. Had it not been for him, you would have been in hell a long time ago, for I should have sent you there by cutting your throat, and no other man but Joseph Smith could have prevented me. And you may thank him for your life. And now, if you will give me the boys I brought from Adam-ondi-Ahman yesterday, I will whip your whole army. To which General Wilson said, White, you're a strange man, but if you will not accept my proposal, you will be shot tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Colonel White, Lyman White, replied, Then shoot and be damned. White was not shot. None of them were. But instead, Lyman White would go to prison with Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail, where he would remain from December the 1st until April 6th, 1839. Please note, Liberty Jail was a hellhole of a dungeon. And Lyman White didn't have to be there. He was a prisoner with the prophet Joseph Smith in Jesus. Lyman White would describe himself as true as the sun to Joseph Smith and would die for his friends. Okay, let's take a break for just a second. That was Far West and Adam-ondi-Ahman yesterday. Now, guys, I just wanted to let you know that coming up in July, on the 17th of July, Dennis Lyman and I are taking a group on a 3-day Pioneer Temple tour of Utah. It's an awesome experience. It'll be our first go. We'll do temple sessions in Logan, Manti, St. George, and Provo. And in between each of those, as we travel in the bus, Dennis and I will be telling you the history of these temples and the inspiring, faith-promoting stories that have happened in them, around them, and because of them. It will be so much fun. If you would like to go on that tour, go to historyofthesaints.org and look it up, or go to tetonstagelines.com for more information. Or you can just plain call me or Dennis. We'll fill you in. Also, I've been talking about this, but next year with Fun for Less Tours, I will be taking this trip again. This trip, this church history trip, chapter 1, that goes from Philadelphia all the way to Nauvoo and Carthage. I'll be in Nauvoo and Carthage tomorrow and the next day with my group now. But if you'd like to come on this chapter 1 of church history, go to funforlesstours.com. Check it out. I am personally inviting you to come. It is an intense, wonderful, life-changing experience, not because of me, but because of the sacred history and sites that you'll visit. Funforlesstours.com. Next year, May 2026. Next story. Joseph Smith and his friends were locked up in Liberty Jail, as I said, from December 1st until April 6th, 1839. They had, while they were there, filed with the court a writ of habeas corpus. And in January of 1839, Joseph and his friends were brought to the courthouse there in Liberty, Clay County, Missouri, before Judge Joel Turnham on that writ of habeas corpus. The 5 men who came: Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Lyman White, Caleb Baldwin, Alexander McRae, and Sidney Rigdon. The whole purpose of that was to decide whether or not that those 6 Latter-day Saints would remain in prison until their trial, or whether they should be let go. Was there sufficient evidence to keep them? Now, as that hearing was coming up, Sidney Rigdon was grievously ill. In fact, they worried that he might not live. So on a cold January day, 1839, the 6 prisoners were brought to the courthouse in Liberty, Clay County. Joseph's 2 attorneys were there. They were Alexander W. Donovan and Peter Burnett, the younger man. The citizens of Jackson County, across the river, had heard about this trial. They did not want those Mormons released. No one in the county wanted those Mormons released. Hence, the courthouse was packed full of rabid, angry anti-Mormons who threatened violence. In fact, they came declaring that they had come to do injury. Now, as the hearing opened, Donovan presented opening arguments, the purpose why they were there. Sidney Rigdon was brought into the courtroom on a bed, a portable bed. He sat up before the court and gave this eloquent defense of why he should be let go and why he was innocent. And in the end, he so moved the court emotionally that Judge Turnham released Sidney Rigdon, let him go. They had to take him out of the jail by night because they feared what would happen. But Sidney Rigdon was released. The other 5 men, their case was not so assured. Now picture this. As the hearing progressed, it came time for Donovan to stand up and give his closing remarks in defense of the prophet Joseph Smith. Peter Burnett, the younger attorney, was there, and he observed, quote, the maddened crowd, which foamed and gnashed their teeth, who appeared wildly threatening in every quarter of the small room. Tensions mounted. And as Donovan stood up to make his final argument, Burnett scanned the room, expecting at any moment that they would be overrun and mobbed by the men in that room. Burnett slipped his hand down to his side and grasped the butt of his pistol. And then quickly, he whispered up to his partner. He said, quote, Donovan, let yourself out, my good fellow, and I will kill the first man that attacks you. And then, speaking of his fellow attorney, Donovan, Burnett said that Donovan indeed let himself out in giving one of the most eloquent speeches he had ever heard. And all the while that Donovan is talking in defense of the prophet, Burnett is sitting there scanning the room, watching every man, hand on the butt of his pistol, ready to do exactly what he had promised to do. Burnett would later remember that he and Donovan were, quote, willing to sell our lives to protect their clients. Well, at the end of that hearing, Sidney Rigdon was released, but the other 5 men, including Joseph, were returned to Liberty Jail, still alive, unharmed, and held over for the circuit court that would be held in March. I've always appreciated the courage of Alexander W. Donovan, his loyalty in standing up for the rights of all mankind. Today, we stopped in Richmond, where there is a heroic-sized statue of A.W. Donovan that stands before the courthouse there in Richmond, Missouri. Donovan is a Missouri state hero. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln had heard of Donovan because of his service in the Mexican-American War. And when he finally met Donovan, Lincoln said of him, "I've met many men and heard about them, but Donovan is the first man that ever lived up to my expectations." And Peter Burnett, the man who also was willing to sell his life in defense of the prophet, well, he went west, where he served on the Supreme Courts of Oregon and California, and is California's first territorial governor. Not everyone who was not a member of the church was our enemy in 1838-39. Let me take you back now. And this event occurs just south of the temple site there at Far West, probably near a place called the Eminence. And to introduce this story, I don't know if faith is really possible without courage. I've lived long enough in my life to know that living the Lord's gospel and staying on the covenant path requires a certain amount of courage and is not for the faint of heart. Let me tell you a story about a girl you probably have all heard about, Mary Elizabeth Rollins. Most of us remember her as the courageous girl who faced a mob and saved the printed sheets of the Book of Commandments in Jackson County by running into a cornfield and lying down upon them and hiding them. That saved those rare copies of the Book of Commandments. But that was not the only time this courageous young Latter-day Saint manifested uncommon bravery for her faith. Late October 1838, armed and angry mobs surrounded the Latter-day Saints in the city of Far West. I told you about that. The Latter-day Saints were grossly outnumbered and stood behind their fortifications. Among them, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, now married with a child. She was there, and she left this awful description of that standoff between the innumerable soldiers and the few Latter-day Saints. "Oh, what a time that was," she said. A part of the bloodthirsty mob camped near the city and placed a cannon in the middle of the road, intending to blow up the place, meaning Far West. Then Mary Elizabeth points out that to her surprise, a flag of truce was raised and men were sent over demanding an interview. With whom? With the non-Mormons that were living among the Latter-day Saints. Well, among those couple of non-Mormons that were living among the Mormons was Adam Lightner. That's Mary Elizabeth Rollins' husband. She leaves this account of what happened when the general's emissaries came over and invited Adam Lightner and the other fellow to leave. She said, "As we approached, General Clark shook hands with the two men," meaning Adam Lightner, the non-Mormon, and the other fellow, "being old acquaintances, and remarked that Governor Boggs had given him an order for our safe removal before they destroyed the place," meaning Far West. I asked the general if he would let all the Mormon women and children go out, and he said, "No." Mary Elizabeth continued, "Will you let my mother's family go out?" To which the general responded, "The governor's orders were that no one but our two families should go. All were to be destroyed. End of quote. Upon hearing that dire announcement, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner responded thus: "Well then, if that is the case, I refuse to go. For where they die," meaning the Latter-day Saints, "for where they die, I will die. For I am a full-blooded Mormon, and I am not ashamed to own it." "Oh," said General Clark, "you are infatuated. Your prophet will be killed with the rest." To which she said, "If you kill him today, God will raise up another tomorrow." "Oh, think of your husband and your child," the general pleaded. To which Mary Elizabeth responded, "I then said he could go," meaning her husband, "and take the child with him if he wanted to, but I would stay and suffer with the rest." At that moment, a man nearby, hearing the conversation, was kneeling down. He jumped up and he ran over and stood between the general and the young mother. And he said, "Hold on there, General." He then turned around and faced her and said, "Sister Lightner, God Almighty bless you. I thank my God for one soul that is ready to die for her religion. Not a hair of your head shall be harmed, for I will wade to my knees in blood in your behalf." End of quote. And just then, another fellow jumped up, stood beside the other, and said, "So will I." The general then turned to Mary's husband and invited him to leave. Adam Lightner refused. He would stay with his wife and child. He would stay with the Latter-day Saints, even though he wasn't one. Well, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner and her family would survive. Heber Kimball and all of the others would survive. That's it. That man who swore he would wade to his knees in blood in defense of her life, that was Heber C. Kimball. And the other fellow who jumped up and stood beside him and said, "And I will fight with him," that was Hyrum Smith. Brothers and sisters, where is that courage today to fight for what is right? I believe it's right there with you. You just don't know it. Last story for tonight. Actually, not a story. I've been thinking about some of the favorite verses that you and I like to memorize. And I know everyone is afraid of Isaiah, but for heaven's sakes, get over it. Isaiah has some of the most powerful, poetic, and beautiful verses, like this one. "Hast thou not known," Isaiah said, "hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increases strength. Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall." And here it is. "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." What beautiful language. Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 are the doom and gloom chapters where Isaiah, the blessed prophet, pronounces woes upon Judah, Jerusalem, and the northern kingdom, and foretells captivity and suffering and death. But chapter 40 is the comfort chapters. Chapter 40 on is where Isaiah suddenly switches gears and begins to speak of redemption and hope for scattered and suffering Israel. And he assures Israel that the Lord has all power, that he can do all things, that no man can comprehend his wisdom, his knowledge, his compassion. He is everywhere. He gives power to the weak, it says, and to them that have no strength. He will increase our strength. And this is particularly relevant. During Israel's hard times and today, Isaiah said, even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. Brothers and sisters, we live in those latter times. Spiritually speaking, even the youths shall faint. Even the young men will utterly fall. We live in difficult times. But then Isaiah extends the Lord's promise. But they that wait upon the Lord, wait there does not mean sit and wait. Wait there means hope, a lively anticipation, going forward with faith, living as though something is expected to happen. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. The Hebrew there doesn't mean just get a fresh surge of strength. No, it means they that wait upon the Lord, who look forward to his coming, anticipate his glory, they will exchange their mortal weaknesses for his divine strength. To what extent? They shall mount up with wings as eagles. Even in ancient times, eagles were revered and respected for their strength, their power. They ride the thermals. They rise effortlessly. And so shall it be with you and I in these last days. If we stay on the covenant path, anticipating with a lively hope the promises, God will renew our strength day to day. He's done it for me today. We will rise heavenward by his strength as eagles riding the thermals. We will be promised that we will run and not be weary. There are times when things are frantic, moving quickly. He will be there to carry us in those moments of intense action. We will walk and not faint. On those other moments when life is not so hectic, things are not so frantic, we will walk. We will not be weakened. My dear brothers and sisters, as a closing thought for the night, I bear witness to you. We live in difficult times, but the promise of Isaiah, they that wait upon the Lord shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. That promise is yours. Good night. God bless. I'll see you next week.